Well, here we are once again in our second week of our study on worry and anxiety. We're in the midst of quarantining at home. It's a difficult time. Many of us are truly worried. We have a tendency to fear, to be anxious. So maybe a little bit of a Bible study. I hope that you will make sure you have a copy of a Bible. We'll get you into a little bit better of a prepared mind to deal with times like these. If anybody had a reason to be anxious, it was the Apostle Paul. I want you to use your imagination for a little bit. Let your imagination transport you back about 2,000 years. Let's go back in time. I want you to envision an older gentleman, and he's gazing out of the window of a Roman prison. He's only about 60 years old, which is not that old in our culture today, but in that culture it was considered pretty old. And he's been a Christian now for 30 years, and there's scarcely a seaport on the Mediterranean he hasn't visited. If you can envision, now this is how I have him, a big full beard, looking out that window, stooped, a little bit bent over. Boy, he's had a tough life. And as if the oppression from the empire weren't enough, Paul also bears the weight of newborn churches. He started a bunch of them all over the place, and they're brand new, and they're young, and they're struggling, and he bears that weight. The members are bickering, fussing and fighting. This is aggravating them. That is bothering them, and they fuss and fight like children. And so much for the easy life of an apostle. His future is as gloomy as his jail cell. And yet to read his words, you'd think he were sitting on a Jamaican beach somewhere, just enjoying life, because his words don't convey his condition. Rejoice in the Lord always, he writes. Rejoice in the Lord always. And again I say, rejoice. Philippians 4:4. Paul used every tool in the box on this verse. He's hoping to get our attention. First, he employs a present imperative tense, so his readers would hear him say, continually rejoice. All the time, just rejoice. Habitually rejoice. Don't let it stop. Don't let it end. Always, always rejoice. And if the verb tense wasn't enough, he removes any expiration date. Rejoice in the Lord, how long? Always. Rejoice in the Lord always. But how in the world can a person obey that command, especially in times like these? Rejoice always? Really? The apostle held firm to this belief. He truly believed it. You have reason to rejoice always. Flip back the flaps of your soul, and you're going to see a series of beliefs that serve like poles to stabilize your life. Your belief system is your answer to the fundamental question about life. And that question is there really anybody out there in control of the universe? Is somebody out there really in control, and do they know what they're doing? So your belief system has nothing to do with your skin color. It has nothing to do with your appearance, what you look like, your age, how young, how old. None of that matters. Your belief system is not concerned with the exterior. It's concerned with the interior. Belief always precedes behavior. Belief is the interior, behavior is the exterior. And belief always comes first. For that reason, the Apostle Paul in each one of his letters addressed convictions before he addressed actions. He always talked about the interior before he talked about the exterior. The beliefs before the behaviors. To change the way a person responds to life, you change the way a person believes about life. The most important thing about you is your belief system. And Paul's, boy, it was Gibraltar strong. Take a close look at the poles in the tent of the apostle, and you'll see one with this inscription: Sovereignty of God. Oh, he believed it. That was his belief system. He believed that God was in control. Sovereignty is the term the Bible uses to describe God's perfect control and management of the universe. He preserves and governs every element. He knows exactly what He's doing. And in the treatment of anxiety, a proper understanding of sovereignty is huge. Psychologists verified this fact when they studied the impact of combat in soldiers during World War II. They determined that after 60 days of continuous combat, the ground troops became emotionally dead. They'd had all they could take. It had numbed them. The reaction is understandable, right? Soldiers endured a constant threat of bomb blitzes and machine guns and blasts going off all around them. That takes a toll. It has an effect. The anxiety of troops was no surprise. They had no control. They didn't know what was going to happen at any given moment. But the comparative calm of fighter pilots was altogether different. Their mortality rate was much higher. Pilots died at a huge rate compared to combat soldiers. But what made the difference? Why were pilots so calm and soldiers so anxious? Well, the pilots had their hands on the throttle. They're in a cockpit. They have a sense of control. They can control to some extent everything that's going on around them. Now think about your situation in life right now. With all of this, with the virus going on, how much control do you have? Well, you can stay in your house, but many of us are getting so tired of that, aren't we? Just to go out and have a meal at a restaurant or to go out and get a hug from a brother or sister at church would be, it's much needed, isn't it? But you don't need a war to prove the formula. Road congestion will do just fine when you're out of control. Just the other day, I was traveling back from St. Louis, and there was a tractor trailer that was on fire on the side of the road. And traffic was backed up for miles, but I didn't know that for almost an hour. Oh boy, I was just going stir crazy because I had no control, didn't know what was going on. Would you never board a plane without a parachute? Never enter a restaurant without bringing your own clean plate and silverware? Never give away your heart because you're afraid that it might get broken? Never step on a crack for fear you break your mother's back? Face anxiety by taking control? You can't. You can't take control, not of all situations, you can't. If only we could, though. But certainty is a cruel impostor. There's not much you can be certain about. That's why the most stressed out people are control freaks. They fail at the quest they most pursue. The more they try to control the world, the more they realize, I can't do this. So the Bible has a better idea. Rather than seeking total control, why don't you give it up? Why don't you relinquish it? You can't run the world, but you can entrust it to God. He can control it. He does control it. That's the message behind Paul's admonition to rejoice in the Lord. Peace is within reach, not because you won't have any problems. That's not the point. But because there's a sovereign Lord. Rather than rehearse the chaos of the world, rejoice in the Lord's sovereignty, like Paul. Listen to some of his writings. This is all again Philippians 1, beginning with verse 12. The things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are for Christ. Oh, the problems were still there, but God was in control, causing it to happen for good. And those troublemakers in the church that Paul was so worried about, those who preached out of envy and strife, chapter 1, verse 15, their selfish motives were no match for the sovereignty of God. Listen to verse 18, Philippians 1 and verse 18. Whether their motives are false or genuine, the message about Christ is being preached either way. Jesus is being preached. So I rejoice, he says, and I'll continue to rejoice. Hear that? I will always rejoice because God is in control. Paul believed, Philippians 2 and verse 9, that God highly exalted Jesus and gave him the name that is above every name. Oh, conditions may have been horrible in that prison, but high above it all, Philippians 2:13 says, was a God who works in you both to will and to do for his good pleasure. Oh, to read Paul is to read the words of a man who, in the innermost part of his being, believed in the steady hand of a good God, and he was in control. He was protected by God's strength, preserved by God's love. He lived beneath the shadow of God's wings. God was in control, and he knew that. My question is, do you? In this time, with the virus and all that's going on, do you realize God is in control? He knows what he's doing. Stabilize your soul with the sovereignty of God. He reigns supreme over every detail of the universe. Proverbs 21 and verse 30, Proverbs 21 verse 30, there is no wisdom, no insight, no plan that can succeed against the Lord. Daniel chapter 4 and verse 35, God does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? Oh, he's in control. God's answer for troubled times always has been the same. Heaven has an occupied throne. That was certainly the message that God gave to the prophet Isaiah. During the 8th century BC, ancient Judah enjoyed a time of relative peace thanks to the steady leadership of King Uzziah. Uzziah was far from perfect. No, it wasn't because of his power. It wasn't because he was a perfect king, but he kept the enemies at bay with God's help. And though antagonists threatened from all sides, the presence of Uzziah kept the fragile society safe from attack for 52 years. But then he died. And Isaiah, who lived during the reign of the king, was left with a lot of reason to worry. Now what? Now what's going to happen? This future is uncertain. In your case, what will happen when your job is gone? Maybe it already is. Maybe you're worried about that. Or your health is diminished. Don't we all worry right now whether we're going to get the virus or come into contact with someone who's transporting the germs? What are we going to do? The future is uncertain. Well, God had a word for Isaiah. The prophet wrote Isaiah 6, beginning with verse 1, some of my favorite words in all of the Bible. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet. With 2 he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Oh, Uzziah's throne was empty, but God's was not. Someone is on it. Uzziah's reign has ended, but God's has not. God calmed the fears of Isaiah, not by removing the problem, not by taking the problem away, but by revealing his divine power and presence. Think of it this way. Maybe you're 10 years old, a bit young to comprehend the accomplishments of your dad, who is a world-renowned surgeon, and you've fallen and twisted your ankle, and it hurts, and you can't walk. In the room walks your dad, and he's still wearing his surgical scrubs from work, but he's home for the evening, and he comes in to take a look at your ankle. Dad, I'll never walk again. It hurts so bad. Dad says, yes, you will. It'll be fine. No one can help me. No one. It hurts so bad. I'll never walk. Oh, I can help you, son. No, you can't. It hurts. Remember those days? Your dad lifts his head and asks you a question. Son, do you know what I do for a living? And you don't know the answer. You know he's a doctor. You know he goes to the hospital. You know your mom thinks he's as smart as anybody in the world. Your dad places a bag of ice on your ankle, says it's time for you to learn what I do. So he brings you with him to work the next day. Go into the office. He retrieves a manual on orthopedic surgery that bears his name, hands it to you. You look at it and you say, "You wrote this?" "Yes, I did, son." He takes you in to meet some of his staff. One nurse whispers in your ear, "He's the best at what he does." The two of you are riding home later that day. You look at your dad and you see him in a different light. Dad says, "You're going to be just fine." This time you believe him. Your anxiety decreases. Your trust, your understanding of your Father increases. See, here's what I think. Our biggest fears are broken ankles to God. Twisted ankles, rather. Those are our biggest fears. He sees them as just a small setback. You're going to be fine. Here's what else I think. The next time you fear the future, rejoice in God's sovereignty. Romans 1:25, He is the Creator who is blessed forever. Hebrews 13:8, He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is King, Supreme Ruler, Overlord of all history. An arch of His eyebrow and 1,000,000 angels will pivot and salute. Every throne is His footstool. Sovereignty gives us, the Christian, an inside track to peace. Of all people, we should not be anxious, not worry, but be at peace. Others see the problems of the world and they wring their hands and they're worried and they're anxious. We see the problems of the world, we bend our knees. We go to our Father in prayer. Oh, Jeremiah did. Lamentations chapter 3. I'm reading now from beginning at verse 17. My soul has been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and so has my hope from the Lord. Remember my affliction and my wandering, the wormwood and bitterness. Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. Jeremiah was the prophet to Judah during one of her darkest periods of rebellion. And they called him the weeping prophet because, well, he was one. He wept at the condition of the people and the depravity of their faith. He was anxious enough to write a book called Lamentations. But then he considered the work of God, and he purposefully lifted his mind to thoughts about his king, and notice the very next words and the intentionality behind them. Beginning with verse 21, this I recall to mind. What does he recall to mind? That he had bent his knees in prayer. I recall to mind, therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I have hope in Him. The Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the person who seeks Him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord. So lift up your eyes. Don't get lost in your troubles. Don't let worry and anxiety take control. Dare to believe that God was speaking to you when He said in Romans 8:28, in everything, God works for the good of those who love Him. Anxiety passes as trust increases. In another scripture, Jeremiah draws a direct connection between faith and peace. Jeremiah 17, beginning with verse 7. Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord and whose hope is the Lord. For he shall be like a tree planted by the waters, which spreads out its roots by the river and will not fear when heat comes. But its leaf will be green and will not be anxious in the year of drought. You hear that? Will not be anxious in the year of drought, nor will cease from yielding fruit. Is God saying the same to you? Examine the poles that sustain your belief. Make sure at least one of them is etched with the words, my God is sovereign. God bless you. Have a great day and a great weekend. We'll see you Sunday morning when we continue our study on Why Worry?